A single mom in Phoenix facing a rent hike she can't afford, and what she does next will leave you speechless. But wait, there's more. Secrets unravel, unlikely heroes step up, and just when you think it's over, a twist flips it all upside down. Will Maria save her home, or will the tycoon win? Stick around to find out. Where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. We love hearing from you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss how it all unfolds. Let's dive in. It was a scorching Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona, the kind of day where the heat shimmers off the asphalt and even the cacti look tired. Maria Delgado, a 38-year-old waitress with tired eyes and a stubborn streak, trudged up the cracked stairs of her apartment complex, the Desert Rose. The building was old, peeling paint, flickering hallway lights, but it was home. She'd lived there for 8 years, raising her 10-year-old son, Mateo, in a cramped two-bedroom unit filled with second-hand furniture and memories. Her shift at the diner had been brutal. Spilled coffee, rude customers, and a measly $12 in tips, but she was used to it. Hard work was her life. In her hand, she clutched a stack of mail she'd grabbed from the rusty box downstairs. Bills, junk flyers, the usual. But as she flipped through them on her way to 3B, one envelope caught her eye. It was thicker than the rest, with the Desert Rose logo stamped in bold black. Her stomach tightened. She'd heard whispers from neighbors about changes coming, but nothing concrete. Standing in the dim hallway, the hum of a distant AC unit buzzing, she tore it open. Notice of rent increase, the letter read. Maria's eyes scanned the page, and her breath caught. Starting next month, her rent was jumping from $900 to $1,170, a 30% hike. She reread it, thinking it was a mistake. There, in cold print, it said failure to pay would mean eviction in 60 days. Her hands trembled. She made $2,000 a month before taxes, and after groceries, utilities, and Mateo's school supplies, there was barely anything left. This wasn't just a stretch, it was impossible. She stumbled into her apartment, dropping her purse on the faded couch. Mateo was sprawled on the floor, doodling in a notebook, his sneakers still on despite her constant nagging. "Hey, mijo," she said, forcing a smile. "How was school?" He grinned, oblivious to her panic. "Good. We learned about volcanoes." She nodded absently, sinking into a chair, the letter still in her hand. That night, after Mateo was asleep, Maria sat at the kitchen table, under a flickering bulb, crunching numbers on a napkin. No matter how she sliced it, cutting cable, skipping meat, working extra shifts, it didn't add up. She'd moved to Desert Rose after her divorce, picking it for its affordability and the little courtyard where Mateo could play. Now it felt like the rug was being yanked out from under her. The next morning she spotted the landlord's name at the bottom of the notice. Richard Grayson, CEO of Grayson Properties. She'd never met him, just his lackey, the building manager, Carl, who smoked cheap cigars and ignored leaky faucets. Grayson was a name she'd seen on billboards around Phoenix, a real estate hotshot, buying up half the city. Why was he jacking up rent here? Desert Rose wasn't fancy. No pool, no gym, just a tired relic from the 80s. Maria tucked the notice into her apron and headed to work, her mind racing. She didn't know it yet, but that piece of paper was about to ignite a fight she'd never imagined, one that would test her limits and change her world. The diner was a blur of clinking plates and shouted orders that Wednesday morning, but Maria couldn't focus. The rent notice burned a hole in her apron pocket, and every time she poured coffee or scribbled an order, her mind drifted back to that number, $1,170. She'd barely slept, her thoughts a tangle of panic and defiance. By noon, her hands ached from gripping the coffee pot too tight, and her usual smile for customers felt like a mask slipping off her face. During her break, Maria slipped out back to the alley behind the diner, where the air smelled of grease and desert dust. She leaned against the brick wall, staring at the notice again, as if the words might change. A shadow fell across her, Luce, her co-worker and closest friend, a wiry woman in her 50s with a smoker's rasp and a no-nonsense stare. "You look like hell, Chica," Luce said, lighting a cigarette. "What's up?" Maria hesitated, then handed her the letter. Luce skimmed it, her eyes narrowing. 30%? That's robbery. Grayson's got some nerve. She blew out a plume of smoke. "What you gonna do?" "I don't know," Maria admitted, her voice cracking. "I can't pay it, Luz. Me and Mateo, we'll be out on the street." Saying it aloud made it real and her chest tightened. Luz flicked ash onto the pavement. "You talked to Carl yet? That slimy manager might know something." Maria hadn't thought of that. Carl was a jerk, but he was the only link she had to Grayson Properties. After her shift, she drove her rattling 03 Honda to Desert Rose. The notice crumpled in her fist. The manager's office was a closet-sized room off the courtyard, its blinds yellowed and crooked. She knocked, and Carl's gravelly voice barked, "What?" Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke. Carl, a balding man with a stained polo shirt, didn't look up from his phone. "Yeah?" he grunted. Maria squared her shoulders. "I got this rent increase letter." 30%. I can't afford that. What's going on?" Carl finally glanced at her, smirking. "Orders from the top. Grayson's upgrading the place. You don't like it, move." "Upgrading?" Maria's voice rose. "The elevator's been broken for a year. There's mold in my bathroom. What upgrades?" Carl shrugged, his smirk widening. "Not my problem. Pay up or pack up. That's the deal." She wanted to scream, but she bit it back. "Can I at least talk to Grayson?" Carl laughed, a harsh bark. "Good luck, lady. He don't slum it with tenants." Maria stormed out, her face hot with anger. The courtyard was quiet except for the hum of cicadas, but she noticed something. Slips of paper sticking out of mailboxes, identical to hers. She wasn't the only one hit. Back in her apartment, she sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. Mateo was at a friend's house, and the silence pressed down on her. She'd fought battles before, leaving her ex scraping by on tips. But this felt different, bigger. Unfair. That night, she couldn't sleep again. The clock ticked past midnight, and she paced the tiny living room, her bare feet scuffing the worn carpet. She thought of her mom, who'd raised 3 kids alone in a cramped Tucson trailer, always saying, "You don't roll over, mija. You push back." Push back how? She was one person against a real estate giant. But then she remembered Carl's smirk, the other notices in the mailboxes. Maybe she wasn't alone. The next morning, Maria grabbed a marker and some printer paper. "From Mateo's school supplies," she scribbled a quick note. "Got a rent hike? Let's talk. 3B, tonight, 7 p.m. Her hands shook as she taped copies to the courtyard bulletin board, the laundry room door, even the broken elevator. She didn't know who'd show up or if anyone would, but she was done waiting for answers. This was her home, Mateo's home, and she'd be damned if she let Grayson take it without a fight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Desert Rose, Maria set out a few mismatched chairs in her living room and waited. Her breaking point had arrived, and it was about to spark something she never saw coming. The clock on Maria's kitchen wall ticked closer to 7 p.m., and her stomach churned with nerves. She'd tidied the living room as best she could, pushing Mateo's crayons under the couch, setting out a plate of store-brand cookies, but it still felt small, cramped, lived in. The kind of place Grayson Properties probably sneered at. She glanced out the window at the courtyard, half expecting no one to show. Who'd care enough to fight this? But then a knock. It was Mrs. Patel from 2C, a tiny woman in her 60s with silver hair and a sharp gaze. She clutched her own rent notice, her knuckles white. "I saw your sign," she said, stepping inside. 30%. My pension can't stretch that far," Maria nodded, relief washing over her. "Mine either. Come in, sit." Mrs. Patel settled into a chair, muttering about how she'd lived here 15 years without a fuss. Next came Jamal, a lanky 25-year-old from 4A who worked night shifts at a warehouse. He slouched in, hoodie up, holding the notice like it was trash. "This is bull," he said, dropping onto the couch. "I'm already pulling doubles. Now, this?" Maria offered him a cookie, and he took it with a shrug. "You think we can do something?" she asked. Jamal snorted. "Doubt it, but I'm here, ain't I?" Then the door creaked open again, and in shuffled Mr. Hensley, a grizzled retiree from 1D with a cane and a permanent scowl. He'd been at Desert Rose longer than anyone, 30 years, he'd brag, and smelled faintly of Old Spice. "Grayson's a vulture," he growled, waving his letter. "Back in '95, rent was $300. Now he thinks he can bleed us dry?" He sat, heavily glaring at the floor. By 7:15, the room was fuller than Maria expected. 7 people squeezed in, voices overlapping. There was Rosa, a quiet mom from 2A with a toddler on her hip, who whispered she'd been saving for her daughter's preschool. And Tim, a scruffy college kid from 3F, who muttered about student loans piling up. Even quiet old Mrs. Chen from a 4B slipped in, clutching a Chinese-English dictionary and nodding along. Maria stood, clearing her throat. "Thanks for coming. I didn't know if anyone would." She held up her notice. "We all got these, right? 30% more starting next month. I can't pay it. Can you?" Heads shook. Murmurs rippled. Mrs. Patel piped up. "I called Carl. He laughed at me, said it's market rates." Jamal rolled his eyes. "Market rates my ass. This place is falling apart." Mr. Hensley leaned forward, tapping his cane. "Grayson's done this before. I read about it. Bought a complex in Mesa, jacked the rent, pushed folks out. Turned it into condos for rich snowbirds." Maria's heart sank. "So that's his plan? Kick us out?" Tim nodded grimly. "Makes sense. Phoenix is hot right now, literally, and for real estate." The room buzzed with frustration. Rosa's toddler fussed, and she rocked her, saying softly, "I moved here 'cause it was close to my job." "Where am I supposed to go?" Mrs. Chen added in halting English. "No family here. This my home." Maria felt their words like weights piling on her chest. These weren't just neighbors. They were people like her, clinging to what little they had. "Okay," Maria said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We can't just sit here and take it. Carl won't help, and Grayson's too big to care. But maybe together—" She trailed off, unsure. Jamal raised an eyebrow. "What, like a protest? Picket signs and stuff?" Mrs. Patel smirked. "I'd wave one. Give that Carl a heart attack." Laughter broke the tension, and Maria seized it. "Maybe not signs yet, but we could look at the lease, see if he's breaking rules." Tim perked up. "I've got a buddy in law school. He could—" "Check it out," Mr. Hensley grunted. "I've got every lease I've signed since '93 in a box somewhere. Might be useful." Maria's pulse quickened. "Good. Let's start there. Meet again tomorrow. Bring anything you've got. Letters, leases, whatever." Nods circled. The room, hesitant but real. As they filed out, Mrs. Patel squeezed Maria's arm. "You're a brave girl. Don't stop now." Alone again, Maria sank onto the couch, the empty cookie plate beside her. She'd lit a spark. She could feel it. But against Grayson's money and power, could it catch? Outside, the desert night settled over Desert Rose, quiet but restless, waiting for what came next. The next evening, Maria's living room buzzed again, this time with a nervous energy that crackled like static. The mismatched chairs were back, plus a folding stool Tim dragged in from his place. Mateo was at Luce's apartment down the hall. Maria didn't want him hearing this yet, not until she knew what this even was. The coffee table was buried under a mess of papers, rent notices, crumpled leases, even a yellowed tenant handbook Mr. Hensley had fished out of a dusty box. Tim sat cross-legged on the floor, his laptop glowing as he typed furiously. "My buddy, Pete, he's the law student, says we need to look for violations, anything Grayson's doing that's not kosher." He pushed his glasses up his nose, squinting at the screen. Mrs. Patel hovered over him, clutching her 2012 lease, the edges worn from years of folding. Kosher or not, he's a thief, she muttered. Jamal sprawled on the couch, flipping through his own lease, a single page, barely legible from a bad printer. This thing's a joke. Says rent subject to change with notice. That's it? Maria frowned, peering over his shoulder. Mine says that, too. 30 days notice. But 30%? That can't be legal. Mr. Hensley tapped his cane on the floor. Back in my day, there were caps, laws about how much they could raise it. Rosa, bouncing her toddler on her knee, nodded. My cousin in California said they've got rent control. Why not here? Tim looked up. Arizona's tricky. No statewide cap, but cities can set rules. Phoenix has some tenant stuff. Pete's checking. Maria grabbed her lease, scanning the fine print. The words blurred, legal jargon she didn't understand, but she forced herself to focus. This was their shot. Mrs. Chen, quiet until now, slid a laminated booklet across the table. This, from when I move in, 2005. It was the Desert Rose Tenant Handbook, faded but intact. Maria flipped it open, and a line caught her eye. Rent. Increases shall not exceed local ordinance limits without tenant approval. She read it aloud, her voice rising. Local ordinance limits, what's that mean? Tim's fingers flew over his keyboard. Hang on, Pete's got something. Room hushed, all eyes on Tim. He grinned, a rare flash of excitement. Okay, Phoenix Ordinance 1245 says landlords of multifamily units like this place can't raise rent more than 10% a year unless they've made substantial improvements. And they need city approval for that. Jamal sat up. 10%? That's like $90 for me, not $270. Maria's heart thudded. So Grayson's breaking the law? Maybe, Tim cautioned. He'd argue substantial improvements. But what's he done? The elevator's still busted. Mrs. Patel snorted. My sink's been dripping since 2019. Mr. Hensley smirked. Roof leaked last monsoon. Ruined. My old radio. Fixed it with duct tape myself. Laughter rippled, but Maria's mind raced. If he hasn't done upgrades, this increase is illegal, right? Tim nodded. Pete thinks so. But we need proof. No improvements, no city filing. Grayson's slick. He might have fudged something. Rosa frowned. How do we check? Mr. Hensley leaned forward. City records, permits, inspections. I used to work maintenance. Everything's filed downtown. Maria scribbled on a napkin. City Hall. Permits. Who can go? I can, Jamal said. Got a day off tomorrow. Mrs. Patel raised a hand. Me too. I'll take the bus. Maria hesitated, then added, I'll switch shifts with Luz. We'll go together. The plan felt shaky, but it was something, more than she'd had yesterday. As the group dispersed, Tim stayed behind, scrolling. I'll dig online too. Grayson's got a trail. That night, Maria lay awake, the handbook open beside her. Mateo's soft snores drifted from his room, and the desert wind rattled the window. She pictured Grayson, a faceless suit in a high-rise, counting his millions. While she counted pennies, but now she had a thread to pull. At 2 a.m. her phone buzzed, a text from Tim. Found a news article. Grayson's flipping properties all over Phoenix. Desert Rose is next. Call me. Her pulse spiked. This wasn't just about rent. It was about survival. The next morning, Maria, Jamal, and Mrs. Patel piled into her Honda, the AC wheezing as they headed downtown. City Hall loomed ahead, a concrete slab baking in the sun. They were stepping into Grayson's world now, and whatever they found could make or break their fight. The Phoenix City Hall smelled like stale coffee and bureaucracy, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Maria, Jamal, and Mrs. Patel stepped inside. The lobby was a maze of counters and signs, permits, licensing, complaints, and Maria's stomach fluttered. She'd never done anything like this, digging into records to challenge someone like Grayson. Jamal adjusted his hoodie, looking just as out of place while Mrs. Patel marched ahead, her purse swinging like a weapon. They found the permits desk after a wrong turn, past a water fountain that didn't work. A bored clerk in a polo shirt barely glanced up. "What you need?" he droned. Maria cleared her throat. We're looking for records on Desert Rose Apartments. Any permits for improvements last few years?" She slid a scrap of paper with the address across the counter. The clerk sighed, tapping at his computer with one finger like it pained him. Minutes dragged. Jamal shifted, muttering, "This guy's slower than my grandma's dial-up." Mrs. Patel shushed him, but her foot tapped impatiently. Finally, the clerk printed a single sheet and slid it back. "That's it. One filing, June last year. Electrical upgrade. Approved, but not inspected yet." Maria frowned, scanning it. "That's all? Nothing else?" The clerk shrugged. "If it ain't here, it ain't filed." Outside, under the blistering noon sun, they huddled by Maria's car. She read the permit aloud. "Grayson Properties, electrical panel replacement, $15,000. Status, pending inspection." Jamal snorted. 15 grand? My cousin's an electrician. That's barely a patch job for a building our size." Mrs. Patel nodded. "And pending? My lights still flicker every storm. They didn't fix nothing." Maria's mind churned. Tim had said Grayson needed substantial improvements for a 30% hike. This wasn't it. "So he's lying," she said half to herself, "or he's hiding something bigger." Jamal pulled out his phone. Tim's article said Grayson's flipping places. Maybe he's got plans he ain't telling. Mrs. Patel's eyes narrowed. "We need more than this. Something solid." Back at Desert Rose, they regrouped in Maria's apartment. Tim was already there, hunched over his laptop, a half-eaten taco from lunch beside him. "You're gonna love this," he said, spinning the screen. It was a Phoenix Business Journal piece from 3 months back. "Grayson Properties secures $20 million investment for luxury redevelopment." Maria read aloud. "Plans include converting older complexes into upscale rentals, targeting up-and-coming neighborhoods." Tim pointed. "Check the map. Desert Rose is right in the zone." Jamal whistled. "Luxury rentals. That's why he's jacking the rent, to push us out." Maria's hands clenched. "But he can't do that without permits, right? Big ones?" Tim nodded. "Major Reno needs city approval, public hearings, the works. I searched online. No filings for Desert Rose beyond that electrical thing." Mrs. Patel smirked. "So he's sneaking it. Typical." Mr. Hensley, who'd shuffled in late, tapped his cane. "I've seen this game. He'll fake small fixes, claim it's enough, then bulldoze us later." Rosa, cradling her sleeping toddler, gasped. "Bulldoze? My daughter's whole life is here." Maria felt the room tilt. Grayson wasn't just greedy. He was ruthless. Then Tim's phone pinged. "Pete again," he said, scrolling. "Says if Grayson's got investors, there's a paper trail, contracts, pitches. Public records might not show it, but someone's got dirt." Maria's pulse raced. "Where do we look?" Tim grinned. "County Recorder's Office. Property. Deals, liens, all that jazz. I'll go tomorrow. Got class till then." That night, Maria couldn't sit still. She paced, the article's words looping in her head. Luxury redevelopment. Desert Rose wasn't perfect. Creaky stairs, patchy Wi-Fi, but it was theirs. She thought of Mateo biking in the courtyard, Mrs. Chen's little herb garden, Mr. Hensley's stories. Grayson wanted to erase it all for condos with granite countertops and $3,000 rents. At dawn, her phone buzzed. Tim, bleary but urgent. "Recorder's office opened early. I found it. Grayson filed a partnership deed last month. Him and some investor, Pinnacle Group. They're splitting profits on a full-side overhaul of Desert Rose. No permits yet, but the deal's signed." Maria's breath caught. "So he's already sold us out?" Tim's voice crackled. "Looks like it. But here's the kicker. Pinnacle's got a rep for bribing officials. If Grayson's playing dirty, we can prove it." Maria hung up, staring at the sunrise bleeding over the desert. Grayson's secret was out, a greedy plot to flip their home for millions. But secrets cut both ways, and she was ready to use this one to fight back. The courtyard of Desert Rose buzzed with nervous chatter on Friday evening, the air thick with heat and anticipation. Maria had spent 2 days rallying every tenant she could, knocking on doors, slipping flyers under mats, even begging Carl for the bulletin board. He'd smirked and said, "Waste your time if you want." Now over 30 people milled around, old-timers like Mr. Hensley, young families like Rosa's, even a few night shifters still in work boots. They dragged lawn chairs and crates into a ragged circle, the sodium lights flickering overhead. Maria stood near the dry fountain, her palms sweaty, as she clutched Tim's printouts, the Pinnacle deal, the ordinance, everything they'd dug. Up, Jamal flanked her, arms crossed, while Mrs. Patel handed out water bottles from a cooler she'd hauled down. "We're packed," she whispered to Maria. "Good turnout." Maria nodded, but her stomach flipped. This was it, their chance to face Grayson head-on. At 6:55 p.m., a black SUV rolled into the lot, tires crunching gravel. The crowd hushed as Richard Grayson stepped out, a tall man in his 50s, with slicked-back hair and a tailored suit that screamed money. Carl trailed him, puffing a cigar, looking smug as ever. Grayson surveyed the tenants like they were ants, his lips curling faintly. "All right," he said, voice smooth as oil. "You wanted a meeting? Here I am. Let's make this quick." Maria stepped forward, her knees wobbling, but her chin high. "We got your rent notices, 30%. You can't do that. It's against city law." She held up the ordinance page, her voice steadying. "Phoenix says no more than 10%. Without big upgrades, you've done nothing here." Murmurs rippled, agreement, anger. Grayson raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I've filed for improvements. Electrical work. It's in progress." Jamal snorted. "Progress? My outlet sparked last week, nearly fried my charger." Mrs. Patel chimed in. "My kitchen floods every rain. Where's your upgrades?" Grayson waved a hand. "Minor issues. The city approved my plan. That's what matters." Maria shot back. "We checked. 1 permit pending inspection. That's not substantial. You're breaking the rules." The crowd grew louder. Rosa called out, "We can't pay this." And Mr. Hensley growled, "You're a damn liar?" Grayson's calm cracked, his eyes narrowing. "Watch your tone. I own this property. I set the rates. Don't like it. Leave." His words landed like a slap, and Maria felt the sting. "But," she pressed on, holding up the Pinnacle deed, "what about this? You're selling us out. Luxury condos with Pinnacle Group. That's why you're jacking the rent, isn't it? To push us out?" A gasp swept the circle. Grayson froze just for a second, then recovered with a tight smile. "That's business. Property values are up. I'm maximizing my investment." Tim jumped in, voice sharp. "No permits for a full overhaul, no hearings. You're sneaking it past the city and us." Grayson's smile vanished. "You've got no proof of that." "Oh, we've got plenty," Maria said, bluffing a little. "Records, deals, your own words online about redevelopment. We're not stupid." The tenants cheered, a ragged roar. Carl stepped forward, jabbing a finger. "You're out of line, lady. This is private property. Meeting's over." But Grayson raised a hand, silencing him, his gaze locked on Maria. "You think you can scare me with papers and noise? I've got lawyers who'll bury you." Maria's heart pounded, but she didn't flinch. "Maybe, but we've got the truth, and the city's going to hear it." Grayson chuckled, low and cold. "Go ahead. Waste your time. You've got 60 days. Pay. Or pack." He turned to leave, but Mrs. Chen, tiny and fierce, blocked his path. "This my home," she said, voice trembling but firm. "You no take." The crowd surged behind her, a wall of defiance. Grayson pushed past, climbing into his SUV with Carl scrambling after. As the engine roared, he leaned out the window. "You're fighting a losing battle. Enjoy your little rebellion. It won't last." The car peeled out, leaving dust and silence. Maria exhaled, shaky but alive. The tenants swarmed her, Jamal clapping her shoulder, Rosa hugging her, Mr. Hensley grinning like a kid. "You rattled him," he said. "First time I've seen that bastard sweat." But as the group dispersed, Maria lingered, staring at the spot where Grayson had stood. His threat echoed. Lawyers, power, money. She'd landed a hit, but he'd swung back harder. Tim joined her, frowning. He's right about one thing. We need more. That Pinnacle angle? If they're bribing someone, we've got to prove it. Maria nodded, resolve hardening. Then we keep digging. He's not winning this yet. The night closed in, stars pricking the desert sky. Desert Rose stood quiet, but the air thrummed with something new, hope, fragile but fierce, ready to flare up again. The morning after the showdown, Maria woke to a pounding headache and a living room strewn with crumpled flyers and half-empty water bottles. The courtyard clash replayed in her mind, Grayson's icy smirk, Mrs. Chen's stand, the tenants' cheers. She'd stirred something, but his parting shot lingered. Lawyers who will bury you. She brewed coffee, the cheap grounds hissing in the pot, and tried to shake the dread. Mateo shuffled in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mom, why's everyone mad at that guy in the suit?" She forced a smile. "He's trying to take our home, mijo. We're fighting back." At the diner, her shift dragged, burnt toast, grumpy regulars, and Luce's endless questions. "You really told off Grayson?" Luce asked, wiping the counter. Maria nodded, too tired to brag. "He didn't budge, though. Just threatened us." Luce smirked. "Takes guts, chica. Don't quit now." Maria clung to that as she clocked out, but doubt gnawed. Guts weren't enough against a tycoon. Back at Desert Rose, she found Tim in the courtyard, pacing with his phone. "Got a lead," he said, eyes bright. "Pinnacle's shady. Fined in Tucson for clerical errors on permits. Smells like bribes." Maria perked up. "Can we link it to Grayson?" Tim shrugged. "Need someone on the inside. City worker, maybe. I'm asking Pete." She nodded, but it felt like grasping at smoke. Then, as she headed upstairs, a voice stopped. Her. "Hey, Maria, right?" She turned to see a woman leaning against the railing, mid-40s, sharp suit, dark hair pulled tight. She didn't look like a tenant. "Yeah," Maria said warily. "Who are you?" The woman stepped closer, voice low. "Lydia Torres. I work at City Hall, planning department. Saw your meeting last night." Maria tensed. "You with Grayson?" Lydia laughed, dry and sharp. "Hardly. I've been watching him for months. Guy's a bulldozer. Thinks he owns Phoenix." She pulled a card from her jacket, handing it over. "Lydia Torres, senior planner. I was driving by, saw the crowd, heard. You call him out on Pinnacle. You're onto something." Maria clutched the card, pulse quickening. "Why help us?" Lydia glanced around, lowering her voice. "Grayson's pushing dirty deals through my office. Backroom stuff, no hearings. Pinnacle's greasing palms, and I'm sick of it. Last year they flipped a complex near my mom's place. Kicked out 50 families. I can't stop him alone, but you've got a shot." Maria stared. "You're risking your job," Lydia shrugged. "Maybe, but I've got kids too. This hits home." That night, Maria called the crew to her place. Tim, Jamal, Mrs. Patel, and Mr. Hensley crowded in as Lydia laid it out. "Grayson's overhaul for Desert Rose. He's got no permits filed, just that electrical bluff. But I found a draft proposal on a supervisor's desk. Full demo, luxury towers. Pinnacle funding it, dated 2 weeks ago." Jamal whistled. "So he's lying." "To our faces," Lydia nodded. "He's banking on you folding before the city cares." Mrs. Patel leaned in. "You've got proof?" Lydia pulled a USB drive from her pocket. "Copied what I could. Emails, that draft. Nothing signed, but it mentions expedited approval, with a councilman's name, Ron Decker. He's tight. With Pinnacle." Tim's eyes widened. "Bribery?" Lydia grimaced. "Can't prove it yet. But Decker's dirty. I've seen him fast-track Grayson's stuff before." Maria's mind raced. "If we show this to the city," Lydia cut in. "Not yet. They'll bury it unless it's airtight. We need Decker's paper trail, payments, meetings. I can snoop. But you've got to keep the pressure on Grayson." Mr. Hensley grinned. "Oh, we'll pressure him. Rattle his cage some more." Jamal cracked his knuckles. "I'm down. What's next?" Lydia mapped it out. "I'll dig at City Hall, quietly. You file a formal complaint with the Housing Board. Cite the ordinance, the lack of permits. It'll force a review, buy time, and make Grayson sweat. Maria nodded, a spark reigniting. We can do that? Tim, you write it? He grinned. On it. Lydia stood. I'll check in soon. Stay loud. He hates that. As she left, Maria felt the room shift. Lydia was a lifeline, a crack in Grayson's armor they hadn't expected. Later, alone, she stared at the USB drive on her table, its tiny weight massive. An ally from the inside changed everything. But Grayson's lawyers loomed, and Decker's shadow darkened the fight. She whispered to the empty room, We've got you now, bastard. The rebellion had a new edge, and it was sharp. The next week blurred into a flurry of late nights and whispered plans at Desert Rose. Maria's apartment became command central. Coffee cups piled up, papers taped to walls, and Mateo banished. To Luce's place with promises of extra Nintendo time? Lydia's USB drive sat like a grenade on the table, its files burned into everyone's minds. Grayson's draft proposal, Pinnacle's name, Councilman Decker's shadow. They had a weapon. Now they had to wield it. Tim finished the housing board complaint by Tuesday, a 10-page beast citing Ordinance 12-45, the fake electrical upgrade, and tenant testimonies. Maria read it aloud to the group, her voice shaky, but proud. Grayson Properties has violated city law, endangering residents. We demand an immediate review. Mrs. Patel clapped. That'll sting him, Jamal smirked. Hope he chokes on it. They filed it Wednesday morning, marching to the housing board office downtown. Maria, Tim, Jamal, and a dozen tenants trailing like a ragtag army. The clerk, a tired woman with chipped nails, stamped it without a word, but Maria felt the weight lift just a fraction. Now what? Rosa asked, her toddler tugging her hand. Tim grinned. Now they investigate. Grayson's gotta answer. Lydia checked in that night, sneaking into Maria's place after dark like a spy. Complaints on their radar, she whispered, eyes darting. Decker's pissed. Called my boss, fishing for who's talking. I'm laying low, but I found something. She pulled a crumpled memo from her bag. Decker met Pinnacle's CEO last month, off books at a golf club. No minutes, but a clerk saw cash change hands. Maria's breath caught. A bribe. Lydia nodded. Can't prove it yet. Keep pushing. I'll get more. The tenants didn't wait. Thursday, they plastered Desert Rose with flyers. Rent. Hike illegal. Fight back. And Tim posted the complaint online, tagging local news. By Friday, a scrappy reporter from the Phoenix Sun showed up. A kid named Alex with a notepad and too much gel in his hair. Heard you're taking on Grayson, he said, eyeing the cracked courtyard. Maria squared her shoulders. He's breaking the law. We've got proof. Alex scribbled fast as Mr. Hensley ranted about leaks, and Jamal mocked the upgrades. The story hit Saturday's paper, a small blurb, but enough. Tenants allege fraud in rent, hike at Desert Rose. Maria's phone buzzed all morning. Neighbors she'd never met, texting support. Grayson's office called too, a lawyer's voice dripping venom. Retract this or we sue for defamation. Maria hung up, hands shaking, but Jamal laughed. They're scared, yo. We're in their head. Sunday, the counterattack kicked. Orna. Lydia slipped Maria a burner phone. Untraceable, she said, and a tip. Decker's meeting Grayson tomorrow, private office downtown. Could be big. Maria rallied the crew. We crash it, she said. Record it. Proof he's dirty. Tim frowned. Risky. If they catch us... Mrs. Patel cut in. We've got nothing to lose. I'm in. Jamal nodded. Me too. Let's roll. Monday dawn, Maria, Jamal, and Mrs. Patel piled into her Honda, Tim's laptop humming in the back seat. They parked a block from Decker's office, a sleek building with tinted glass, and waited, nerves jangling. At 9:15, Grayson's SUV pulled. Up then, Decker's silver Lexus. Maria gripped the burner, recording audio as Jamal aimed his phone camera through a crack in the car window. Voices drifted, muffled but sharp. Tenants are loud, Grayson snapped. Your people need to squash this. Decker's tone was oily. Relax. I've got the board tied up. Reviews stalled. Pinnacle's next payment clears Friday. Grayson growled. Better. I want them out by summer. The words were gold. Bribery, collusion, caught on tape. Maria whispered, We've got him. But then, headlights. A security guard's truck rolled past, slowing. Go, Jamal hissed. Maria floored it, tires squealing as they peeled out, the guard's flashlight swinging behind. Back at Desert Rose, they replayed the audio, hearts pounding. It was grainy, but damning. This'll blow it open, Tim said, uploading it to a cloud drive. Lydia, dialed in, breathed. Send it to the Sun, anonymously, now. By midnight, Alex had it. This is huge, he texted Maria. Front page tomorrow. She sank onto her couch, the burner still warm in her hand. The counterattack had landed, a direct hit on Grayson's empire. But as the desert night hummed outside, she knew he'd strike back harder. The war was on, and they'd just lit the fuse. Tuesday morning broke over Phoenix with a blazing sun, but inside Desert Rose, the air crackled with something fiercer, anticipation. Maria barely slept, the burner phone's audio looping in her head, Grayson's growl, Decker's oily, "Promise?" The Phoenix Sun hit newsstands at dawn, and Tim rushed in with a copy, ink smudging his fingers. The headline screamed, Landlord caught on tape, rent hike scheme exposed. Below, Alex's story laid it bare, Grayson's illegal hike, Pinnacle's bribes, Decker's dirty hands. The grainy transcript was there, every damning word. The courtyard erupted as tenants snatched copies, Mrs. Patel whooping, Jamal fist-bumping Tim, Rosa hugging Maria so tight her ribs ached. We did it, Rosa cried, her toddler clapping obliviously, but Maria's gut twisted. Not yet, she said, scanning the article. They'll fight this. Mr. Hensley nodded, grim. Grayson's got deep pockets. He won't roll over. By noon, the blowback hit. Grayson's SUV screeched into the lot, flanked by two suits, lawyers, Maria guessed, their ties flapping as they stormed Carl's office. Tenants gathered, whispering, as Carl poked his head out, face red. Meeting's canceled, he barked, slamming the door. Then Maria's phone rang. Lydia, voice tight. Decker's freaking out. Called an emergency session with the housing board. Tonight, 7 p.m. They're rushing to kill the story. Maria rallied the crew. We go, all of us. They can't ignore this now. Tim nodded. I'll call Alex. Get press there. Jamal grinned. Time to make noise. They spent the day prepping. Flyers multiplied. Tenants texted friends. Mrs. Chen even baked cookies for the crowd. By 6 p.m., Desert Rose was a ghost town. Every resident packed into cars, vans, even a borrowed church bus, rolling downtown like a tidal wave. The housing board room was a sterile box, long table, 5, stony-faced officials, a handful of reporters in back. Decker sat at the head, sweating through his suit while Grayson loomed beside him, eyes cold. Maria led the tenants in, 50 strong, filling the seats and spilling into the aisles. The chairwoman, a stern woman named Ms. Ortiz, banged her gavel. Order, this is a closed review. Jamal cut in. Closed? After that tape? The room buzzed, cameras flashing. Maria stepped up, heart hammering. We're from Desert Rose. Grayson's breaking Ordinance 1245, 30% rent hikes with no upgrades. He's bribing Decker to flip our home for Pinnacle Group. We've got proof. She slapped the Sun article and a USB with the audio on the table. Decker sputtered, lies, fabricated. Grayson sneered, this is harassment. My lawyers, shut it, Ms. Ortiz snapped, grabbing the USB. She played the audio through a laptop, the room dead silent, as Grayson's voice filled it. I want them out by summer. Gasps echoed. A reporter, Alex, shouted, Councilman, care to explain? Decker's face drained white. I don't... Ms. Ortiz cut him off. We'll verify this. If it's real, it's over for you both. Grayson stood, towering. You've got nothing. I'll sue this city to rubble. But the tenants roared back, Mrs. Patel yelling, Try it, thief! And Mr. Hensley banging his cane. Maria locked eyes with Grayson, unflinching. We're not leaving. You're done. For the first time his mask slipped. Fear flickered, then rage. He stormed out, Decker scrambling after, chased by reporters. Ms. Ortiz called a recess, voice clipped. We're freezing the hike pending investigation. Stay put. This isn't settled. The tenants erupted, hugging, crying. Maria sank into a chair, legs jelly, as Jamal clapped her back. You stared him down, Maria. Legend, she laughed. Shaky, but real. Outside, news vans multiplied, Channel 5, 12, even a national crew. Alex grinned at her. This is blowing up. You're famous. That night, back at Desert Rose, the courtyard glowed with lanterns and laughter. Someone blasted music, kids ran wild, and Mrs. Chen passed out cookies. Maria stood by the fountain, the sun crumpled in her hand. Grayson was cornered. Decker. We do, but she knew he'd claw back. Still, they'd won this round. Tim sidled up, grinning. Lydia says Decker's suspended. Investigation's fast-tracked. Maria exhaled. Good. We're not done fighting. The stars glittered above, and for once Desert Rose felt like home again, not a battlefield. The final stand had shaken. The giant and Maria knew they'd keep standing together no matter what came next. The weeks after the Housing Board showdown felt like a dream to Maria. Hazy, surreal, but edged with a quiet victory. Desert Rose buzzed with a new rhythm. Tenants waved instead of whispering, kids raced bikes in the courtyard again, and even the flickering lights seemed less ominous. The Phoenix Sun ran follow-ups daily. Councilman Decker resigns amid probe. Grayson Properties faces fines. And Maria's name popped up so often Mateo started bragging at school. My mom's a hero, he'd say, grinning. By mid-month, the Housing Board ruled the 30% rent hike was void. Grayson's electrical upgrade didn't pass muster, and without permits for a full overhaul, he was stuck. The ordinance held, rent capped at 10%, a manageable $90 bump for Maria. Pinnacle Group pulled funding, spooked by the scandal, and whispers spread Grayson was selling off properties to cover legal fees. He's bleeding, Tim said over. Tacos one night, smirking. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Lydia became a regular at Desert Rose, dropping by with updates. Decker's done. Caught on tape with another developer, too. Idiot never learns, she told Maria, sipping coffee in the kitchen. Grayson's quiet, but he's not gone. Watch your back. Maria nodded, grateful but wary. She'd learned power didn't vanish. It just slunk away to regroup. The tenants didn't let up either. Mrs. Patel organized a watch group, checking city filings weekly. Jamal and Tim built a website, desertrosefights.com, posting updates and tips for other renters. Mr. Hensley dug out old photos of the complex, turning the laundry room into a mini-museum of their history. Keeps us grounded, he said. Pinning up a faded shot of the 90s courtyard barbecue, Maria framed it. Proof they weren't just tenants, but a community. One Saturday, the courtyard hosted a real party, potluck style, with Rosa's tamales, Mrs. Chen's dumplings, and Luz hauling in a diner pie on the house. Music blared from Jamal's speakers, and Mateo led a pack of kids in a water balloon fight, soaking Maria's jeans. She laughed, a sound that felt lighter than it had in months. Alex showed up, notepad swapped for a beer, grinning. You're my best story yet, he said. Next Pulitzer's on you. As dusk settled, Maria climbed the stairs to her balcony, the noise fading below. She pulled out the crumpled rent notice from that first day, its edges worn. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a spark that had lit a fire. She'd been scared, broke, exhausted, but she'd fought. They all had. Mrs. Patel's stubbornness, Jamal's fire, Tim's brain, Lydia's risk, it wove together into something Grayson couldn't break. A tap on the railing startled her. Mr. Hensley, cane in hand. Proud of you, girl, he said, voice gruff. Reminds me of '95. We fought a slumlord then, too. Won that one. You're tougher than I was. Maria smiled, eyes stinging. We did it together. He nodded, hobbling off, leaving her with the desert night. Weeks later, a letter arrived, not from Grayson, but the city. Desert Rose tenant grant, $50,000 for repairs, funded by ordinance fines. Maria read it thrice, stunned. At the next meeting they voted, new elevator, roof fixes, a playground for the kids. No more duct tape, Mr. Hensley chuckled. Maria added, and a sign, Desert Rose stays. That spring, she stood in the courtyard, Mateo at her side, watching workers install the playground slide. The air smelled of fresh paint and blooming mesquite, and the complex gleamed, not luxury, but theirs. She'd lost sleep, cried in the dark, but she'd found something too, strength she didn't know she had, and a family beyond her door. Grayson was a shadow now lurking somewhere, but Desert Rose stood tall. Maria tucked the old notice into a drawer, a relic of the fight. She whispered to the breeze, "Thanks, Mom, we didn't roll over." Then she grabbed Mateo's hand, heading to the party below. The rebellion was over, but the victory, that was just beginning. And there you have it, the end of Maria's incredible journey. From a single mom staring down a rent notice she couldn't pay, to leading a whole community to take on a real estate giant, she showed us what grit, heart, and a little teamwork can do. Grayson thought he could bulldoze Desert Rose, but Maria and her neighbors proved that home isn't just a place. It's a fight worth winning. What did you think? Did this story hit you in the feels, or maybe spark some fire of your own? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and I'd love to know what you'd have done in Maria's shoes. If this tale of strength and perseverance moved you, don't forget to smash that like button and share it with someone who needs a boost. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. We're so close to 10,000 of you amazing people, and every new friend helps us keep bringing stories like this to life. Where are you watching from today? Shout out your city or corner of the world below. Let's see how far Desert Rose reaches. And stick around. Next time, we've got another epic waiting, full of twists you won't see coming. Thank you so much for watching, for being part of this journey. You're the real heroes keeping these stories alive. Have an awesome day, and I'll see you in the next one.